Hello, my name is Nancy Stokes. I'm the curator at Kimball Arts Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program, a conversation with Cara Despain and Jackie Berry, which was recorded to accompany Cara's exhibition at Kimball Arts Center, In Memoriam, Carbon Paintings by Cara Despain. Before their conversation begins, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce our two wonderful speakers. Cara Despain is an artist working in film and video, sculpture, photography, and installation, addressing issues of land use, the desert, climate change, land ownership, and the problematics of frontierism. For the last 3 years, she has been collecting burnt debris from wildfires in the western United States and using it as a drawing tool to create large-scale paintings of pure carbon, serving as markers of a changing climate and existing in memoriam of the consequences of human habitation on our planet. Jackie Berry is a multidisciplinary artist, wildland firefighter, and Masters of Natural Resources candidate at Oregon State University with an emphasis on forest and climate change. Her focus in both her art and forestry practice is to bring knowledge and clarity to empower communities looking to learn more about fire ecology and forest management. Jackie is currently exploring how art as a science communication tool can be a more approachable way to disseminate information to towns and to communities affected by climate collapse. Thank you so much to Cara and to Jackie for this conversation, and I want to thank you as well for watching. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Go.
Got it. Here we go.
Coming to you not live from Salt Lake City and Denver. Seat of the
On either side of the Rocky Mountains.
Oh my God, we were on the exact same page about that.
We've got a tin can and a string going straight through, bringing
right.
it to you.
Did you know that that's what the internet is? It's just a system of strings and cans.
That's literally it, actually.
I am Cara Despain. I am an artist, and I have a show up at the Kimball Arts Center right now called In Memoriam. It's a series of my carbon paintings, and I'm very excited to be here with Jackie Berry, a friend, fellow artist, and former wildland firefighter. And we're going to jump right into talking about all things fire. My exhibition that's behind me-ish, in kind of for real, kind of for fakes. I'm going to just go over really quick the process of making these carbon paintings and a bit about why I do it. And we will go from there into Jackie's intro and talking about fire and firefighting. So I started making these pieces about 3 years ago as the sort of immensity of the fires in the States, especially the Western United States and this region, were kind of ramping up and getting worse. And I was sort of grappling with this idea of how to sort of like bring that conversation front and center from my platform, which is art, and sort of confront people with the reality of what's going on. And I felt like the most direct way to do that was with the material aftermath itself, which is in a way kind of the cause and the end result of these mega fires, which is pure carbon. So I went to a bunch of different burn scars. I started with, I believe, Malibu, the Woolsey fire in California. And I did go to Paradise, which was a campfire, also in California. And I collect debris, and I use that basically as giant drawing tools to saturate large scale canvases. And so what you see in these pieces is basically just carbon residue. So they're all black, kind of like big fields of smelly ash. They do continue to shed a bit. I do fix them. And then I started recently erasing either the name of the fire or something related to the location. And each piece is a specific fire. And I kind of chose to not do anything more pictorial beyond that. I kind of just want it to be about the kind of like facing off with this material. And we can get into some more of this later, but I would say that they are meant to inhabit the kind of lineage of landscape painting and that whole, all of the notions that conjures with this sort of false narrative of wilderness and frontierism and also settlement and manifest destiny and colonization. But, you know, they're in that landscape format and they're in that shape and size. And then also, you know, I guess you could get to kind of like a Rothko feeling from them, but with a very different intention. So that's kind of where my head's at. Definitely don't mean them to be finger waggy. I see this crisis as something that we're all implicated in, including myself, which is partly why I want to center that conversation with the work. So, all, you know, Jackie and I have so much in common, like with our lines of thinking about this. So we're just gonna get into it. And Jackie, maybe a good place to start is sort of just parsing out a little bit for people that might not know what wildland firefighting means, what a hotshot is, how the different agencies work, and yeah.
That was beautiful. Hi, my name is Jackie Berry, and I am an ex wildland firefighter and hotshot with the Santa Fe Hotshots in New Mexico. And yeah, I mean, you know, wildland fire is pretty interesting in that I think I grew up in Philadelphia and I didn't know what it was. I think it's like really, I think for the first time, because it's becoming much more like on a global stage, on a national stage, and because things like smoke from wildfires are being smelled and seen on the East Coast, I think it's coming to a large stage, and that's all being like exacerbated by climate change. But wildland firefighters are just, they're firefighters like you would think of in the city, or like municipal fire departments, which are called structural fire. Except you're in the wildland, you're in remote places, you're going to forest fires, anywhere from what's called the WUI, the wildland urban interface, or like somewhere completely remote, complete wilderness. And essentially what that looks like is you, because it's so remote and off grid a lot of the time, the ways you get into fires are quite unique. There are different types of engines in the wildland. They're not, they're just essentially large, big trucks, like normal trucks, but outfitted with might be water or tools or food. But that'll have like your basic essentials on it. But most fire crews, if you're not on like an engine crew, hike many miles to get to the fire. Or if you're a smoke jumper, you'll get flown into a fire and you parachute out. So it's unique in that you're carrying what you need on your back. So food, water, tools, GPS tools, weather tools, I mean, all sorts of stuff. And it can end up being like 50 pounds. You're walking, you're carrying heavy shit, you're hiking to the fires. What do you do when you get to the fires? I think there's this idea that all fire is put out with water, but if you're in a remote location, you're not hiking in enough water that's going to put out a fire of 100,000 acre fire.
Yeah.
So what it looks like is essentially you're landscaping. I mean, you're digging and you're removing what's called like, you're removing all like vegetative fuel down to mineral soil. So like all flammable debris is pulled away from the surface until what you're left with is just dirt with no like fuel or like burnable material left in it. So you're essentially choking the fire of what it wants, which is more timber or more fuel. So you're digging around you're digging around a fire.
Wow.
um, which is, it's funny, it can seem so like antiquated, but it's actually proven to be the most, I mean, to this day, it's the most effective way to put out fires.
Doing
We'll
ditches and
get,
stuff, doing perimeters and things like that.
yep. Yeah, so you'll do perimeter stuff, you'll do back burning, so you carry on your engines or buggies, depending on what your um, transport vehicles are, you'll carry drip torches. So you could do back burns, which are essentially like kind of like prescribed burns against a anchor point, against a line that you want the fire to not cross. So it's a really effective way to stop a fire, is to actually burn all vegetation before it gets to it, which might seem a little silly to light more stuff on fire, but it's actually probably, yeah, extremely beneficial and helpful in terms of like suppressing fires that are out of control.
Yeah, because one's the enemy you know, and the other is the enemy you don't. One is
Yeah.
sustainable and predictable because you're managing it, and the other is what you're trying to rein in.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of the basis of wildland fire and what that looks like. You will get like aerial support, so like large like air tankers and helicopters with buckets of water, and the planes will drop aerial retardant, so it's the pink stuff that you see that just kind of helps in slowing a fire if fire is encroaching on some fuel or some timber. It just kind of slows it down. It helps. It by no means like it is very helpful, and all water is helpful, and it will always be like taken if offered, if resources are available, but the primary way is still extremely like primitive. Just dig. Yeah.
Yeah, because I guess in a sense, fire, it's not fire itself that fundamentally changes. It's the forest and the way that we've managed fuels or not managed them, and it's also like putting different ignitions in areas where they weren't before. But fire is the same as it's been since all of time and eternity. It just burns stuff that is in its way. So it makes sense in that way that you would continue to manage it with those same kind of like traditional tools and methods.
Yeah. I like that. I like what you said. Like fire hasn't changed. It's all the stuff that it wants to like, that is combustible. That's what's changed. The landscape has changed.
Yeah.
The landscape and of course climate change. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, this is all to say that the type of wildland firefighting that you've done and these other crews like the smoke jumpers, you all have really been on the front lines in a way that I think kind of remains invisible to people. And partly that's because you're way back in the backcountry in a lot of instances. Firefighters that are working on structures, which you I'm sure have done that also in areas that are at that urban interface zone. But I think that that's what people visualize, and that's kind of what they see more often. But this is some of the most intense, some of the hottest, some of the most difficult to reach fires, the terrain and everything. So I think it's good. It's good to let the people know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's it's extremely invisible. Like it's you don't see, if you're in a city or in a suburb or a neighborhood, like there's a lot of people who have seen houses on fire, or like unfortunately maybe someone, you or someone has had a house of theirs burned down. But like, and you see that like a lot of time, you think of like urban areas when I think people think of fire, and you won't see us. Like,
Yeah.
you are not gonna, you can't like yeah, it's funny. I've had a conversation with friends about like, man, I really wish you guys could visit me at work. And it's just simply never going to happen.
Right.
But yeah, so I was on a hot shot crew, and the hot shots and smoke jumpers are essentially just like kind of like the Marines, or like maybe the smoke jumpers are like special forces or something. Just very kind of first ones there. Historically, the name comes from being on the hottest part of the fire. So like the
Mhm.
gnarliest part of the fire, dude. Like you're just in it, dude. Um, and it's wild. I mean, it's extremely, the physicality of it is one of the, probably the hardest thing a lot of people will ever do. Um, you're hiking, you're carrying all your stuff, you are digging all day, or removing timber by cutting, you're dropping trees and pulling them out of the way. Um, and it's all your stuff is always on you. So while you're digging or while you're doing all this stuff, you're never letting your bag down. So you're constantly wearing like anywhere between 30 and 50 pounds while you're doing everything. And then hiking and camping
And as far
yeah.
as like, I've been really curious about the protective gear that you're able to wear, in a practical sense, and also that's available to you in those different situations.
So all wildland firefighters wear Nomex, which is like the yellow shirts and typically green pants. They're like a fire, I think, which is kind of ironic. I want to say that DuPont like makes them. uh, but it's fire, by no means fire proof, but it's fire resistant. It doesn't want to catch the second you try and light it. So you wear those, so long sleeve shirt, long pants, and typically leather boots, leather boots with like a really sturdy sole, and a helmet and gloves. So you're pretty covered, which is also, you know, aside from being next to flames, like, yes, that's great, but also you're working fire season happens during the hottest parts of the year. So
Right. Oh my
it's
God.
hot. You're in the desert, you're in 120 degrees wearing all this stuff,
And the
and you're next to
wind.
fire. So it's pretty hot.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so your respiratory equipment though,
none.
and that's crazy to me. I mean, we've talked a little bit about this just casually, but like I can see why it wouldn't be practical in terms of how you have to move around.
Mhm.
But then it also, on the other hand, seems so insane that you're there breathing in all that smoke and ash. Because even, and I can't even pretend to understand what you go through when the fires are burning. But even seeing the burn scars when I go to collect debris, every time I'm at one, I'm like, man, Jackie, she must have been like, this is crazy. Like, because I like with all the foliage and everything burned out of the way, you can see the different like issues, like there's really steep cliff sides there's a foot to several inches of ash just on the ground. So, and it kicks up, like even what I collect, I wear a respirator to collect the debris. So I can't even imagine what it's like to be tromping through it, cutting down trees, dragging stuff around. And that doesn't even include the active smoke that's coming out or the burning embers. So, yeah, maybe you could talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, it is smoky.
I,
It is really smoky.
the smoke hundreds of miles away is terrible, just ambient
Mhm.
atmospheric smoke when the fires are burning in the season. I can't even
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah, and it's funny, I remember, maybe it was in 2018 was a pretty gnarly season,
Yes.
and I was up in Washington, and I had friends texting me who lived in Seattle and in the Bay Area who were asking me what kinds of masks I used for, this is before pre-mask,
Yeah.
pre what we knew. Now we know everything about masks, but like people were like, what kind of mask do you wear like for fire, so like you don't have to breathe all this awful smoke, and the air quality in Seattle is purple on the scale, it's so bad. And I'm like, oh, we don't I don't know, I literally don't know. Like yeah, you just kind of, it's just part of the gig. And I honestly couldn't tell you why it hasn't, other than like thinking about the practicality of like maneuvering around with like a respiratory device, and you're always wearing goggles, so it's like how does that not clog your eyesight when you're
Yeah,
working with
right.
saws or like other dangerous material? Or
Dang.
I honestly don't know. I think it's just impractical, honestly, like for how intensely physical it is, but I don't have a good answer
Yeah.
other than it's smoky and
Terrible. I mean, it must be terrible to breathe.
yeah,
I mean, and
it's
the health impacts and implications of that must be pretty rough.
mhm.
And I've heard some things about kind of a lack of support in the post fire or in between fire seasons for crews like the one you were on.
Mhm.
Hopefully some recent legislation is helping that, but it seems like it's still really lacking. I don't know if there's anything you could say about that.
Yes. I mean, to mine, or in terms of actual legislation that's been passed, that, sorry, I'm just looking for this, that helps firefighters. So I do believe, and I don't remember what the bill is, what it was
Yeah.
called going through, but they were trying, the last I heard, to raise the minimum wage, because it's just, I mean, it's laughable. Like municipal firefighters, structure fire, get paid a very comfortable living wage, and people in the wildland really, like, it's become worth it to people because you have a way to make a decent amount of money in a short amount of time. So in historically what's like, the summer fire season, you can make like a good chunk of change for a few months. And
Even just by the
you
sheer amount
know
of hours.
sheer amount of hours, and that's just all coming in through, if you work for a federal agency, like, you'll get hazard pay, you'll get overtime,
That's good.
um, but that, it's still not enough.
Oh,
That's what makes it even possible. But it's really gotten to the point where crews aren't people are really taking a stand, and crews aren't being able to fill all of their spots. Hotshot crews aren't being able to become available, for the national firefighting groups, like to be like sent on fires, because I think last year in California there were like at least six empty ones, just because they didn't have a full crew, so they weren't allowed to go out.
yeah.
And people are just, it's getting more dangerous because of climate change. The season is being longer, like, becoming longer, and you're extending every year. Like, I was on a fire a couple years ago, and like they said, okay, this is our last fire in September, and then they're like, actually, this is the last fire. They kept extending us because
Oh
they
wow.
simply couldn't afford to um, let us go. And it's just becoming, people are like, what am I doing this for? Like, if I get hurt on the job, it's hard to put in a claim to get everything paid for, and then I'm missing work, and then I get no help in that. And um, there's a lot of there's groups like, grassroots wildland firefighters, who are like taking those issues to legislative roles, and like trying to get things passed. But it's tough.
Yeah. I mean, I can't even imagine just the amount of time that you're away from your life. You know, it seems like it's at least 6 months, but as you're saying, they're kind of extending so it can become 8 months. Um, and it's not just like 9 to 5 because it's fire again. Fire, you know, doesn't really abide by a normal working day schedule, so you might be on a fire for 24 hours.
Mhm.
And I mean, I just don't think that this level of kind of intense work can really be understated. It's and the other thing that I have learned just in the last several years over the course of doing all the research and the collection process is that, like, I didn't really realize that there were so many different um, kind of like agencies that overlap or don't overlap when it comes to firefighting. So there's like Cal Fire in California, but then there's wildland firefighters that are usually federally funded, not always, but usually. And then there's also like privately funded weird little firefighting groups. And then there's prisoners in the case of California, which is a whole other kind of fucked up topic.
Mhm.
But that, you know, and everybody gets paid differently. And the federal ones seem to come in at the lowest wages from what I have
Yeah.
read. And
So
that was surprising to me.
yeah, it's truly wild. um I'm trying to
Other
remember.
than prisoners, of course, which is again, that's like
Yeah,
a
yeah, I
that's
mean,
like a whole
like a couple dollars a day
unreal,
for incarcerated firefighters.
unreal.
Um, yeah, let's see, I worked for a private crew for 2 years, and um, I can't remember what I was paid, but it was, I remember you like kind of, if you start off in like contractor fire world, you kind of want to get on an agency crew. So federal crew, meaning that could be Forest Service or BLM or Fish and Wildlife or BIA. Like there's a host of different organizations who have different hand crews, engine crews, or hot shot crews or smoke jumpers. And federal agencies give their workers hazard pay. So if you're working on a dangerous thing, you get like an extra, few dollars per hour. So you kind of want that when like contractors, like I remember being in that world and everyone's like, oh man, wish we got hazard pay. But I do remember like you get like a lump sum per day that was honestly pretty comparable. And when I think about like being a member of a hotshot crew, like thinking about the qualifications and the certifications that make a hotshot crew type 1 in terms of like emergency response. So it's kind of like the highest tier of emergency response in terms of the incident command system.
Yeah.
um, it's just laughable. It's like I can't believe how little we're getting paid for this. And like, anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good chance if you want to jump into your video to kind of, as we've been talking about all this, it might be nice for people to see what is kind of actually what we're talking about and what it's like on the ground.
Yes, that is a great idea. Yeah, so this video, I'm like, I'm the weirdo artist on every crew I've been on, who just takes pictures of everyone and is always taking videos. And people on the cruise, they like love seeing them. Like everyone wants photos of them with fire, and so I was like kind of that girl, like just going. I made this like end of season video for 2020 when I was on the Santa Fe Hot Shots. Let me see if I can share.
It makes sense in terms of visibility to like have somebody documenting,
Absolutely.
you know.
Yeah.
I think it's important that you do that.
Is that working?
Yes.
Cool. Let me. Full screen. Cool. Is sound working? So that's a bit what it looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like, the video itself is like 5 minutes, but that was just a little tidbit of it.
You can find it on your Instagram, right? In your like TV section. I would recommend anyone interested in watching the rest of it, because again, it's hard to find like documentation of what you guys are doing out there. And so when I watched that, I was like, damn.
Yeah. Maybe what I can do is I'll I think it's on YouTube. It's on YouTube or Vimeo, like one of those.
I think it's on
But,
Vimeo. I think you've sent me a link to that before.
Okay. I'll maybe what we can do is like do a resource page that people can click
Yes.
stuff. I'll put it on there.
Yeah. So what would you, I mean, like thinking about all of this and just kind of, there's so many layers. And it's not like anyone's, like when we say, oh, this is so invisible, it's not like anyone's fault that they don't know about what's happening. It's just we're in like the middle of this really large scale systems change that is difficult, I think, for anyone of us individually to kind of like wrap our minds around. But as somebody that's been like really deeply on the front lines, what do you think the public is seeing versus what you might want to reveal or convey?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think like the public perception of fire as a whole is like, that's devastating, that's awful. Like people associate fire with like death and loss. The colonial worldview was that fires were destructive to timber supply. People see woods after they've been burned and see, well, aesthetically, like that's ugly, that looks really bad, like something really bad happened, for all that to light on fire. And I feel like there needs to be more education surrounding fire as a keystone ecological process, and how fire has always been here. And it truly wasn't until like colonialists came and like settled out west and pushed the indigenous populations out of the way that fire became an issue. Like indigenous people had a very, very specific relationship with fire. And also it's hard for, I think, specifically white people to comprehend the complexity of like the worldviews that indigenous and native people had regarding fire and the natural world in general. It wasn't separate. It wasn't this like, I must conquer this to build a thing. It was, how do I work with the tools given to me to foster like life for myself and my family, but also for like Mother Nature as a whole. It wasn't this like other category. And I really feel like since we, as like, when I say we, I mean like white people got here, it has become a problem. So, back in the early 1900s, the Forest Service was started, and that was a big reason for that was the fires of 1910. So there were these devastating fires in the Northwest that caused Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot and others to like be like, okay, we need to have a force that is strictly dedicated to fire suppression.
Yes, and pristine, preserving this idea of pristine
Yeah,
wilderness, which was kind of fabricated at that point anyway.
exactly. And this idea that like, okay, you know, fire, which nowadays the vast majority of fires that are started, wildfires that are started, are human caused, but that's not how all fires are started. Like when I say keystone ecological process, I mean like ecosystems have adapted to live with fire and even require it for life. So for instance, there are some trees that have what's called serotinous cones, and it has this resin on the outside of a cone, and it will only germinate if it gets, the cones fall down and it gets hot enough and burns so that this resin can fall off and the seeds can germinate. Like they're quite literally like fire, like thriving, adapted ecosystems. And so this is just like general knowledge that I think, people didn't understand. They didn't understand back then. So we create the Forest Service. The Forest Service's goal is to put out every single wildfire the second it starts. And before we know it, we've got decades of complete and total fire suppression that it wasn't until I think even I want to say 70s or 80s that we even like had a thought that, oh, wait, we have, we've been on it. We've been suppressing every single fire that has come up in the West since the early 1900s. And what that has done is actually overcrowded our forests.
Yeah.
So completely taken out this thing that the earth completely relies on for death and regrowth and recycling of nutrients in the soil and nitrogen cycling. And now it's like, okay, we've got too many trees. And so we've got too many trees and a warming climate. So, I think it's really easy for people to say, oh, this is all climate change, which, it's a huge part of it is like, undoubtedly. And there is a completely separate part that just comes down to, ignorance in terms of forest management. And
I mean, there's a really great, we'll put this in the resources too, a really great podcast called California Burning that gives like a really awesome overview and kind of picks through all the layers of this. But something I think is interesting that talks a bit about too is exactly what you said. Like when I was a kid, certainly I was raised with Smokey the Bear. Like every fire goes out, like be careful, no fire, like there can't be any fire at all. Fire is the enemy. We are going to fight it's almost like this militaristic approach. Even the language of it is fairly militaristic in terms of like just suppression, fight it, conquer it. And, even environmentalists, like you were talking about the establishment of the Forest Service, even environmentalists and conservationists for decades wanted to extinguish all fire and not intervene by having controlled burns and things like that. And that was very counter at the end of the day to what we really need to be doing. And it is kind of like, even if that has good intentions, it's still pretty anthropocentric to think that we could be that hands off and hands on at the same time, because we have precipitated a crisis by the lack of management. And it's only recently, I think too, like you were saying, that environmentalists have started to come around to, yes, we do need to do control burns. Yes, we do need to manage fuels. And we have to be honest with ourselves about like how that plays into climate change, because they just kind of dovetail, and then there's, like at first there was also that element of wanting to protect logging interests, That's also why we have some of the trees that we have here.
Mhm.
But it's, now we're at a point where, well, where can we circle back and try to like thin fuels and use those logs instead of like clear cutting and using a heavy hand?
Mhm.
Can we have like a more holistic approach to management that like also includes indigenous tribes again? And like, I mean, I don't know if I see another kind of way around that. I think we have to be much more collaborative.
Exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of like all these people have I think seemingly, there's seemingly disparate camps of people like the loggers and the
Yeah.
environmentalists or the firefighters or the forest, like, and really everyone has the same interest in mind, in my opinion. And that's, people we need trees. We need trees for wood. We're still building houses out of wood. We're still making paper, like,
Yep.
um, but yeah, how do we work with um you know paper people working in like logging for
Yeah.
paper lumber, and like you said, kind of fit that in with like, oh, okay, like, can we do it, can it be more nuanced and not completely wiping out, thousands of acres of this huge swath of forest and
Yeah.
completely devastating that ecosystem.
Yeah, because fire is better than that.
Right,
Like,
exactly, yeah.
like completely. And I've seen, I think the troublesome fire, which I have a piece in the show from that burn scar. Like when I went there, and I mean, in any of these events, my heart goes out to people that lost family, homes, all of that. I mostly saw just the wildland area, and that was burnt to a degree that I hadn't even fully wrapped my mind around. But that's better because those, like, there was, and the fire was about a year ago from when I went, there was already stuff starting to sprout. And it was kind of magical to see some of the new growth coming from the ashes. And it is a very nutritive thing. It's just a matter of managing it so that we don't have these huge out of control fires. But if you
Right.
clear cut something, you leave nothing behind.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's been a history of like no nuance. It's
Yeah.
been extremely like, black or white. And I actually have a good slide
Oh, yes.
that oh, whoops. I'm so bad at computers. Here we go.
It's, it's a learning process that you got to find the right can to pick up. And sometimes the strings get knotted up. So, what are we supposed to do?
What are we supposed to do? All right. Is that working?
Yeah. I think now, yeah, there you go.
So, these are like a few different things that are happening that are making fires worse. That's a warming climate, denser forests, more human ignitions, more homes in harm's way. And that's all contributing to a bigger wildfire problem. So like I said, century of fire suppression, there's simply too much fuel.
Yeah.
So this pattern makes fire response more difficult and dangerous. And in terms of climate change, since 2000, 75% of forests in the Western US have become significantly drier. I mean, just, this talk is happening days after the Marshall Fire in Boulder, or right outside of Boulder in Superior and Louisville. And here in Colorado, I've never seen a winter this warm. It's been in like the 60s and 70s and not snowed down here in outside of the mountains. And even on the mountains, on the foothills, there's no snow. There wasn't. And all that grassland, all the prairie, like kind of where right outside of Boulder, like right before you hit the Flatirons and the foothills, it was primed to burn. It was just simply the perfect conditions
Yeah.
for burning. And So that just happened the other day, which is a December, end of December, almost January wildfire, which I honestly don't know if that's happened here before.
Yeah.
So warming climate, denser forests, the wildland urban interface, like,
Oh, that's a great photo to convey that.
I mean, yeah, that's truly like, that's like we're building homes in more wild places. And so it's also not, I think people have this idea of people living really remote, like out in the woods, or this idea that, oh, if you're lucky enough maybe to have like a remote dreamy cabin or like mountain home or something, that you must be like really privileged or something. I think people think of like the Malibu fire,
Yeah.
and that's simply not true in terms of like risk to like more economically like what's the word I'm trying to say, unfortunate like communities. Like it's just simply that's not the case.
Yeah, because some of it, not all of it, but some of it certainly is sprawl, but not all
Mhm.
sprawl is upper middle class.
No,
There's
not at
also
all.
lower income sprawl, and those communities are even more pressed for resources.
Mhm. And then more humid ignitions, and they're most common in the wildland urban interface. So that little zone where suburbia or neighborhoods bump up right next to what was like a completely wild place. And so that's the main issue. Is first of all, it's like a very anthropocentric, like you said, problem of, well, fires are bad because humans live in wild places in
Yeah.
homes built out of wood. Like, what did you think was gonna happen?
Yeah. I mean, like if you put an ignition in any area, you just increase the risk. I mean, that's just what it is. Like even the Parley's fire that happened over, just a couple weeks actually before the show opened. And Parley's Canyon is just like 5 miles. It's the route from Salt Lake to Park City where the show is at the Kimball. And that started, and this is the way many fires start, is a car, was having an issue and pulled over on the side of I-80, the highway, and it, the engine gets hot, or there's like one tiny spark on that dry grass that grows along the side of a lot of interstates and freeways, like, and that's it. And then around that, you have all these other super dried out fuels. But like cars, car fires start all the time like that, especially in Utah. There's a lot of like uh, freeway side fires that start exactly that way. But if we didn't have, it that's not something that would happen without the presence of people.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So here's just an image of, on the left, kind of what our forests look like. And I think it might be hard for people to understand, like, what is it like? People have different ideas of what a forest looks like, depending on your proximity to it, depending on,
Yeah.
Whatever. But the vast majority of them, especially in places like California, are really dense in a way that they never were historically. You can Google their images that I used on that other talk, Cara.
Oh yeah.
That just show the same mountainsides in Montana in the early 1900s compared to
Yeah.
In the 80s, and how different like a whole swath of forest can look in just under 100 years, just from one key element being taken out of that, and that's natural fire via lightning strike.
Yeah, Yellowstone is a good example of that. Like, I've been going since I was a kid, of course, because I live in the region, and I remember there was a major fire there in like the 90s, I want to say. But that's a key part of that ecosystem, and even the park materials say that. And most of it is lightning strikes. But now, I went there recently this summer for the first time in a while, and you could see those old burn scars but where the newer forest has started to grow and kind of integrate, and it makes, like, these graphics are perfect because it looks exactly like that one on the lower right. Like, it maintains it so that it just can't become so dense. And
Yeah,
it's
because
a delicate balance.
what you'll have in an area that's completely wiped out by like a extremely catastrophic fire is you're losing an entire swath of forest land. And so then whatever grows back is all of the same age. So you lose that like succession of like different species and different ages. Like there's huge benefit to a diversity in terms of like biomes, and like in ecosystems is probably the most important aspect of a healthy, like the most important indicator of a healthy ecosystem is diversity. And that's
Yeah.
across the board in age and species and all sorts of stuff. But
And so in these two cases, what you're saying is that, like, on the left, this is a fire that is the result of unsuppressed forest management. Or I mean, sorry, suppression of fire, but also not a management of fuels. So then it's burning the upper story and the upper canopy, whereas a forest that's been managed, the fire doesn't get, it burns closer to the ground. Am I understanding this graphic?
check this out.
Yeah, perfect. Check this out.
So these graphics were put together. I didn't make these. These were put together by the Lower Trinity River Prescribed Burn Association. They're like an amazing group that's been putting out in Northern California, that's been putting out some graphics that I think are doing an amazing job of creating that gap between like the general public and like fire science and firefighters and forestry practitioners. So I mean, high intensity fire, this is exactly what it does. It completely wipes everything out, allows for no CO2 capture, too much ash, which then creates a hydrophobic soil. So actually no water is able to permeate. There's so much ash and nothing to hold on to water. So it just
Rolls off.
It completely just goes off. And a low intensity fire, ideally, is good for mineral soil. It gets rid of ladder fuels, which are the smaller, like closer to ground, maybe saplings or lower branches on trees that allow the fire to escalate to the crown and become unmanageable. CO2 release, gets rid of fine fuels, which are like the flashy fuels that makes things ignite really quickly. It's actually really hard to light a tree on fire, you know, like it has to be
Right.
it has to be pretty dang hot, and a lot of stuff, the duff layer, and like all the fine flashy fuels like pine needles and all that. You have to have a lot of that and a lot of that to start burning and allow it to climb up via ladder fuels. So kind of getting rid of all that small stuff is extremely beneficial. It's beneficial for light in terms of getting into the forest canopy and helping like mycelium and like other micro ecosystems on the forest floor. Yeah, so I mean, the main goal is to, all this is to say, is that prescribed fire needs to be paid as much attention by the federal agencies, by agencies in general, private agencies, municipal, county, whatever, as fire suppression. Like we're at the point where we need crews, we need a workforce that is solely dedicated to prescribed burning. Because what happens is prescribed burning historically happens when firefighters, you know, when there are no fires yet. It happens in the off season. So like firefighters like me will do it before a season starts going off or at the end of a season. But there need to be people that are strictly dedicated to that, because what happens is then fire suppression season starts and everyone goes away and all those goals fall by the wayside. When actually we need proper funding and resource allocation and training and education and all of these things to implement these goals, which we've known for years. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, we've had this data for years, and we're kind of we're at the really important point right now where that needs to become made into action.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you're talking about that, I'm thinking of the kind of more conceptual or art historical side of all of this, which is, landscape painting has always been meant to be these kind of fecund landscapes, these beautiful romantic landscapes, and that was especially true here in the American West. And part of, I think, what I'm trying to undermine with these carbon paintings is kind of like this is sort of the reality of the new American West or the new global frontier. But in thinking about it now, that's like such a way that we ignore like all of the issues we've been talking about in just kind of taking responsibility for managing these wildland areas. And I think we need to like retool our notions of romantic landscape. And those depictions need to include the realities, and so they need to include fire. I mean, I think that partly that romantic sense of pristine wilderness and these beautiful forests in the western US is what was the driving force behind fire suppression. And
Mhm.
we need to be more realistic, and I think both of us are coming at this problem from different angles, like from different experiences of it. You being on the front lines, you want to convey to the public, no, fire is part of this. And me from the art side, post fire, I'm wanting the exact same thing.
Well, that's why, honestly, like, you calling this body of work landscape paintings is unbelievable. It is like, that's exactly what they are.
They're very
Like,
deeply that.
and I think once people, I mean, that's what I truly believe in terms of like art being the conduit from like this weirdo, like bottleneck, like esoteric, like science bubble, which is what natural resource managers are the people who take the science and actually implement it to make change in the societies and in the wildlands to benefit people and earth simultaneously.
Yeah.
But like artists have such a huge role in that, in terms of education and in terms of like, people don't know what, like, I talked with Julie White's, that other artist who's
Yeah.
amazing in performance pieces about fire, and she wants to bring people to burned places. And anyway, that's a whole other thing, but that no one knows what that looks like. No one, and like the vast like hugeness and the blackness of your pieces, like I feel like illustrate that completely and make it matter to people.
Yeah, I hope so. Because, and it's important for me to go and bear witness to these burn scars. Um, and again, it doesn't even, I was gonna say hold a candle, but I'm like not trying to say that way on purpose. um, but it doesn't even compare to what it's like when it's burnt.
Insert fire joke
All the
analogy.
fire joke metaphors, but I like don't even try to do it at this point. Um, but yeah, I mean, just seeing the aftermath is very impacting, and for that reason, it feels important for me, if I'm going to make that work, to kind of witness that. And
Absolutely.
I think that now that I've seen enough of the different types of burned areas, because like Paradise was a whole different thing than like the East Troublesome Fire area, then Malibu. They're all unique. But seeing some of the just extreme, miles and miles and miles of pure intense fire burn, pure black, it it gave a new feeling to the work, and it reaffirmed for me why they need to be as large as possible,
Yes,
so that people do
absolutely.
feel overwhelmed by it.
And also, I think kind of what I was talking about earlier about this idea that like black land is really bad. Crystal Colden is this amazing like fire expert researcher out of University of California, Merced, and I listened to a talk of hers, and she has spoke about like how we need to change this perspective out west, because so many people out east, like they just don't see it or connect to it. But a lot of places out west, like you might drive by and you can see that an area has been burned, and you might be with a group of people. Maybe you're in a car, or maybe you're biking, and you can change the conversation from like, wow, that's extremely devastating. Like, I wonder, or even in like language about fires in terms of acreage, like, man, that fire was 300,000 acres. That fire was 1,000,000 acres. Like, how devastating. And of course, like with values at risk, loss of life, all of that is, no one is trying to say that that is not devastating. But kind of like switching it to be like, wow, like, look at this huge area of burned forest, like that this forest must have really needed fire really badly. And fire hadn't been introduced to the landscape in probably 80 years, 100 years. Like, wow, what is this going to look like after? And even like little things like that, from peer to peer, shifting of language and communication, I think are what is going to make this more of a conversation that can be brought to local legislation, local fire management resources, and federal resources ultimately.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that makes so much sense because it's complicated. Like it's not as cut and dried as we want it to be in order for it to be an easy conversation. But I mean, nothing is. And this climate, there are so many fine-tuned little details that are out of sync, and that's why we're in this situation. And so, there has to be space for yes buts everywhere because, yes, this fire is devastating and awful, but is all fire bad? No. It needed to be a less intense fire, but it still needed to be fire. Mm-hmm. And those kinds of like more nuanced conversations, I do think are exactly what we need. But also, like you were saying earlier, nuanced ways of thinking and managing, because it's been way too blunt force trauma. It's been way too heavy handed.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, I have a little like, and if, feel free to ask me anything else too, but I feel like I like where this is going. And a logical question that I have been thinking about for you is like, how has this affected your kind of like, how's wildland firefighting specifically and all the stuff we're talking about? Because now you're about to get a degree in forestry.
Natural resources.
Resources, yeah. So, how is this all affecting your sort of like life philosophy and outlook, and also what you are doing artistically?
Yeah, I didn't bring that up. I'm also an artist.
I want to come back to that.
I forgot to include that because I really haven't been making art. I'm probably assume I'll be making quite a bit less now that school starts tomorrow. But yeah, I think it's a pretty common path, like in terms. I think it is like working in fire and wanting to go to school about fire, because entering the firefighting workforce, some people fall in love with it, some people hate it and literally disappear. I told you.
Yeah.
We show up to a fire and like two guys literally hitchhike out of there, like disappear.
So bonkers.
Wild. Anyway, and I think I just fell in love with it. I mean, for me, like, I probably should have started with all this, but like, I got my bachelor's degree in printmaking and book arts, and did a lot of printmaking in school, graduated school, and my art kind of like turned into a whole different, kind of similar to you, just like multidisciplinary. I don't like, for a while it was fabric, for a while it was drawing, for a while. And I think I just got to a point living in Colorado where I was like, man, I'm like sewing all day, every day. Art making can be really solitary. My like, how do I like get paid to be outside? And I started volunteering with the Boulder County open space and mountain parks, and they just needed people to help like chip some chip some fallen trees, and kind of volunteer like every so often in their woods and help out. And I, all for fire mitigation purposes, and I like started to learn about it through these guys. I say guys because I was the only girl,
Whole
which
other
is
topic
very
there.
yeah. And but what is gender anyway? And I started to fall in love with it and was like, I really can't believe that these people are paid to be outside. How do I do that? And that ended up in me getting a job on a crew in Washington, and I returned for another summer and just loved it. Like it was just like, how do you're in the most remote, wild places getting paid.
Yeah.
Work is really hard, but it's extremely beautiful. And it like gave me like bird's eye view of like what is happening in these remote places, especially with buzzwords of like climate change or
Mhm.
environmentalism, like all of that I've always been interested in, but being on the front lines of that. And yeah, so I think, and then I went to work for the Hot Shots in New Mexico. And I think it is all just, it's left me wanting more in terms of um, reach. All that work, all this to say, prescribed fire needs to happen. Fire suppression is still very necessary, like,
Yeah.
because we are people living in places that have valuable things, we will always need fire suppression. It's not going anywhere. But it did make me be like, okay, I kind of want to do more about this than being the kind of feeling I'm like a soldier. I feel like there's a lot of like this it's very paramilitary style, like training and like your day to day and how your crew operates.
Mhm.
And it that sort of makes you disconnected from the goal as a whole, because you are so myopic and like, okay, this fire needs to go out right now. And I think
Right.
for me, I was interested in the more bigger picture,
Yeah.
and the bigger picture just being like, how can we get better at this? How can we get better at communication to communities who are the most at risk for fire? And yeah, how do I incorporate art in that sense? I remember like my first year in Washington, one of my crew members was like, it's so weird that you're an artist and you're a firefighter. And I'm like, what? Why? Like, but I think what he was saying was simply that like fire is like so hard, like you're like a really hardened dude if you're doing it.
Yeah.
And uh artists are soft. I think that's simply what he meant. But I'm like, damn, like you're hiking around all day in like the most beautiful places in the world, and like sometimes stuff's on fire, and you're like talking to like homeowners who live in these kooky middle of nowhere places, and you're talking, I'm like, this is kind of like the best like fuel for an artist. Like I was like,
Yeah.
I have ideas. I'm just literally outside for
Totally.
6 months out of the year. Like,
Totally.
and
Makes perfect sense to me, but
yeah, right. But there is this like, it's hard and this is soft, and like,
yeah.
this is they do not intersect. They don't have anything to do with one another. And I think that is something that I'm really interested in, like, dissolving.
Yeah, that's exactly the same. I mean, that like runs a perfect parallel to everything we've been saying. You know,
Mhm.
it's not a black and white thing. And in fact, we need all the like complicated, nuanced spaces in between. So we
Mhm.
need the soft, we need the hard, but we have to like figure out how those can all be layered and communicated together. And like it just has to be more holistic at this point.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, does that feel like a logical like wrapping up point? Is there anything else we want to like cover?
I feel like we did a good job.
Yeah, I feel like we crushed it. Quite if I may say so.
Crush.
Crushed it.
Yeah.
Um, is there a way that maybe they add the resource links at the end in the edit?
Yeah, I think I'll have that. I have that already, some good podcasts and articles and websites, and
Perfect.
yeah, a lot of really good stuff.
Well, we're speaking to you as a ghost now, audience, because you're not here now with us, but you will be when you're watching this. If you did watch it, thank you for doing so. Been a pleasure, Jackie. We could shoot the shit for the rest of our lives, and hopefully we do.
I can't wait to see you again.
I know. Let's make that happen. We're on either side of the Rockies.
Yeah, great. I'll start walking.
Meet you there.
Yeah.
Meet you in the Uintas. See you at the top.